welcome back in. Today we're discussing our Week 8 must-start defenses and kickers. With so many teams on bye this week, this is definitely going to be a crucial week to be streaming, whether it's defenses or kickers. Because this week we have the Lions, Jags, Raiders, Cardinals, Rams, and Seahawks. The bye-mageddon week. Let's go ahead and get right to it. We're going to start with just a couple of my top defenses. Now, both these defenses are rostered now in well over 60% of leagues, but I do want to mention this really quickly. As far as the Chiefs are concerned, this is going to be a situation to monitor ahead of the Monday Night Football game at home against the Commanders. Jaden Daniels is scheduled to undergo an MRI on Tuesday after he left in the second half against the Cowboys with a hamstring strain. Marcus Mariota is obviously the backup here. Not just Jaden Daniels' status that we're going to have to monitor. It's also Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel, who both have missed last week's game against the Cowboys. This is also going to play a pretty key role here in how great I feel about the Chiefs' defense this week. But the Commanders are generally not an offense that I do look to attack, but they do allow nearly 3 sacks per game to opposing defenses. Overall, they've allowed the 17th most fantasy points to defenses. But like I said, if Daniels is out, I think the Chiefs are a pretty easy top 5 defense this week. Let's keep moving here. Let's move over to the Patriots. The Patriots are finally starting to get their flowers as a defense. Now, for most of the year, this defense was widely available. And I think I've pretty much had them on most every video I've done so far this year. They're finally rostered in over 80% of leagues. The Pats are currently the DST2, averaging 9.3 fantasy points per game. Their 18 sacks ranked top 8, and their 9 turnovers ranked top 10. This is an impressive turnaround by Mike Vrabel, considering the Pats were among the worst defense in the league last year. But next up for the Pats, they match up against the Browns, who have yielded the 11th most sacks, and over their last 3 games have actually allowed nearly 3.5 sacks per game, which ranks top 7. On the season, the Browns are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. We are definitely firing up the Patriots again this week. Let's move over to our top streaming options of the week. And we're going to start with the defense that is available in over 90% of leagues, and that is the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons have quietly been one of the more consistent fantasy defenses this season. They're currently the DSC 13, averaging just over 7 fantasy points per game. They currently rank 14th in sacks, 6th in INTs, and 14th in forced fumbles. Now, digging a bit deeper, the Falcons have actually done a very good job limiting opposing offenses. They rank 8th in points allowed per game and 2nd in yards allowed per game. Next up, the home matchup against one of the worst offenses in the league. On the season, the Dolphins are allowing 2.5 sacks per game to opposing defenses, which ranks 14th. However, over their last 3, things have really started to fall apart, as they're allowing now over 3 sacks per game, which is top 8. As far as turnovers are concerned, Tua is now tied with Geno Smith with 10 INTs. Falcons were easily going to be one of my favorite defenses this week, and I think you're firing them up. They're a top 3 defense for me this week. Keep moving here. We're going to move over to the Indianapolis Colts, rostered in 49% of leagues. Now, bringing in Lou Anarumo as the team's defensive coordinator might be one of the more underrated coaching changes of the year. The Colts defense is turning around pretty quickly. The Colts are currently have the 5th most sacks, the 3rd most INTs, and are currently averaging 8.9 fantasy points per game, which is top 3, just behind the Seahawks and Patriots. Now, the Titans are currently allowing the 2nd most sacks per game to opposing defense at a rate of 4.3 per game. Cam Ward has also turned the ball over at the 5th highest rate. The Colts are rostered just under 50% of leagues. We should probably change that considering how well they have played all year. The Titans allowed 13.3 fantasy points per game to opposing defenses, making them my top DST of the week. Let's keep moving here, and let's move over to the Tampa Bay Bucks. The Bucks have been a bit up and down as a defense this year. They have 2 weeks of being a top 6 scoring defense, but also have been unusable in 4 other weeks. Well, this is one of those weeks. While I expect them to bounce back to being a top 10 defense this week, the Bucks currently rank 12th in sacks, which comes as no surprise considering Todd Bowles' propensity to bring pressure. His defense routinely ranked top 5 in pressure rate every year. The Saints' offense is certainly not one we are afraid of, and they just allowed 15-plus fantasy points to the Bears last week. On the season, the Saints have allowed the 11th most fantasy points to opposing defenses, so the Bucks, widely available. Really like the Bucks this week. Now, these next 2 are kind of bonus DSTs that I wanted to hit on really quickly. I don't feel as confident with these 2, but I do think if you're in a league where there's just not a ton of defenses available, I think both of these defenses make some sense, and both of them are available in almost 95% of leagues. The first one's going to be the Cincinnati Bengals against the Jets. Now, there's certainly some risk here, and we're definitely going to want to see if Trey Hendrickson is back for this game, but I think the Bengals become a viable streaming option against the Jets offense that is allowing a mind-boggling 6.7 sacks per game over their last 3. The Jets are a complete mess and will likely be without Garrett Wilson again this week. The Jets are allowing overall the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing defense. So while the Cincinnati Bengals is certainly not a great defense by any stretch of the imagination, I do think this Jets offense is that bad. and I think we could look to fire up the Bengals in a pinch. Lastly, the 49ers defense against the Texans. The 49ers defense has suffered a ton of injuries, but continue to play well. They are a young defense, but Robert Saleh has done a good job despite losing Nick Bosa and Fred Warner. Next up is a matchup against the Texans, who have yet to figure anything out on the offensive side of the ball. And to make matters even worse, on Monday, Nico Collins suffered a concussion in the second half of that game. It was such a short turnaround. I find it really hard to imagine that Nico Collins is going to be able to make it back in time to play on Sunday against the 49ers. So I think the 49ers are also a pretty strong play as well. Let's move over to the kickers. And the first thing, we're just going to move over straight into the streaming options because we have quite a few I want to hit on here. First, my first streaming option of the week is going to be Will Reichard versus the Chargers. Now, I mentioned Reichard as a streaming option last week against the Eagles. He finishes the top scoring kicker. He converted on all 5 of his field goals in his only PAT. He's currently the kicker 10, averaging 10 fantasy points per game. On the season, he sports a very good 92% conversion rate and ranks top 6 in field goals of 50-plus yards. He's also been fairly consistent, scoring 8 or more fantasy points in every game but one. Reichard and the Vikings now take on a Chargers team that is allowing the 10th most fantasy points to opposing kickers. Next up is going to be Luke Havrisik versus the Steelers. In his last 2 games, he's taking over for the injured Brandon McManus. Havrisik has scored double-digit fantasy points in both of those games. He finishes the kicker 11 and kicker 6. He's already showed off his big leg with a field goal of 61 yards. Now, this is going to be a very fluid situation with Brandon McManus nursing a quad injury. McManus did sign a 3-year extension this offseason for $15 million, with $5 million of that being guaranteed. I doubt they opt to move on for McManus, which means once he's ready to return, Havrisik will be gone. If McManus is out this week, though, Havrisik will be a top 10 kicker for me. But I do want to mention, if McManus returns, he would slot right in at the same spot that I have Luke Havrisik here. So the Steelers are allowing the 9th most fantasy points to opposing kickers. So it's a very good spot. Whatever kicker that's going to be kicking for the Packers on Sunday Night Football. So let's keep moving here. And we're going to talk about Tyler Loop. Loop was looking very good prior to Lamar Jackson going down with an injury. Over his first 4 games, Tyler Loop was the kicker 10, averaging 10.3 fantasy points per game. But over his last 2, he dropped to kicker 31, averaging just 3.5 fantasy points per game. On the season, Loop has converted 90% of his field goals and has the 5th most field goals from 40 and 50-plus yards. Hopefully, Lamar Jackson can return this week against the Bears. I will say on Monday, Lamar Jackson did not practice, but that's really not a big deal to me whatsoever. I do think that he plays because I don't see how the Ravens can keep losing games and think that they're going to be able to make the playoffs at 1-5. I would be a little bit surprised if Lamar Jackson wasn't ready to go after the amount of time that he's able to miss, plus the bye week. So I do think he plays, but if Lamar Jackson were to be out, I would be out on Tyler Loop this week. Next up, let's move over to Evan McPherson. And I've been pretty much an Evan McPherson hater the last couple of years, and I will be the first to admit that. But last week was the first week he scored more than 7 fantasy points in a game. But now some of that is because the ineptitude of the offense once Burrow went down. But he's only converted 83% of his field goals, which is below league average. But with all that being said, he's still in a great spot this week against the Jets, who have allowed the most fantasy points to opposing kickers. So I don't mind Evan McPherson this week as an option. And lastly, John Parker Romo, purely a matchup base, but the Dolphins have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points to kickers this year. I think Romo is a decent streaming option again this week. So that being said, if you have any questions, and I'm sure people will, because of all the decisions we have to make this week with buys, streaming options, stuff like that, be sure to leave them in the comments section below. We'll get all those answers for you. Let's get them dubs this week. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.